could argue about it. They could then check up when somebody says, oh, this is in the agreement. It wasn't hard to find whether it was or wasn't. This was not really the case for the agreement in Colombia. So there were vulnerabilities that were there right from the start. When it came to selling the agreement, there were also problems, partly for the reasons that I've mentioned, partly, and I know President Santos would say this himself, he wasn't necessarily a born salesman. On a number of occasions we met and talked about this, and he felt badly about it. He really tried extremely hard. There are some people who are better salesmen or women than others. Tony Blair, for example, was an excellent salesman. Afterwards, sometimes people wondered what they'd bought from him. And that produced subsequent difficulties on a number of grounds, including in Northern Ireland. But as far as a salesman was concerned, he was particularly good. That, I think, was a degree of vulnerability. And I'm hesitant to be very critical of President Santos because I think he did an extraordinary job in very difficult circumstances, personally difficult circumstances, as he explained to me. But there was a difficulty in selling the deal. And in fact, when I talked to President Uribe to try to persuade him, or former President Uribe, to try to persuade him to be more open about the agreement, he actually assumed that the agreement would go through. He said, who on earth is going to vote against peace? Well, it was pretty obvious he was one of the people who's going to do it. But he actually thought that it was a winning docket. And it turned out to not quite be the case. But I think when it came to implementation, that's probably where some of the really substantial difficulties occurred. I've said to people in Colombia, but also in many other countries where there have been peace deals and peace processes, that these things need to be national commitments, not governmental commitments. If you have a situation where the government that is trying to do the deal with the insurgents, whoever they are, and there's a major opposition party or parties fundamentally opposed to the whole process, that's a vulnerability. It's a very major vulnerability. Now, you'll never get a situation where everybody's signed up for it. But if you get a really major part of the community that is opposed to it, then that's a difficulty. Not just because it's hard to sell, but because during the process of implementation, there will almost certainly be a change of government. And if a change of government means that people come into government who are opposed to the agreement or were opposed to the agreement, either because they didn't agree with it or quite frankly because it wasn't their agreement, and there are some politicians who, if it's not mine, it must be wrong. And if it's not wrong, I'm going to oppose it anyway. And so that's a vulnerability. And that's why you want to try to make any peace process a national process and a national commitment. I think that is one of the wider lessons that we take. Now, you can't always achieve that. And that doesn't mean that you don't do it, but it does mean that when you're approaching it, you understand the vulnerability that you have. There have been a number of things about the Colombian peace process and agreement, however, that have been very positive. Not necessarily because they were all able to be fulfilled perfectly, but they were very positive approaches. One, for example, was the question of victims. And there was a very early recognition that victims were important, a victim law was passed. Now, one could be critical of the law itself, one could be critical of its implementation, and quite legitimately so. But the very fact that it was done, the fact that at an early stage the needs of victims were recognized, is frankly something that we in Northern Ireland could have learnt from Colombia if we hadn't been doing our peace process first, because we didn't really pay proper attention to the victims. And later it became a running sore, and it still is a problem in Northern Ireland, how to deal with the victims and how to deal with the legacy of the troubles and of the violence. So I think that is an important thing that Colombians understood and that they tried to do something about. And if they weren't able to do everything that might have been done, nevertheless, we should recognize that as a very positive thing. A second thing related to that that's really important to recognize is the legacy of all of those who have been harmed and damaged and the question of how to deal with it. My background is in psychiatry, and I'm used to a situation where if somebody has difficulties from their experience of the past, either I will see them or I would arrange for someone else to see them and work with them as an individual, or maybe bring a small group of people together, 8 or 10 people, and work with them over a period of time to deal with the problems. That's fine if you've got a small number of people. But if you have got hundreds of thousands, possibly even millions of people who are victims in various ways, then your whole approach to how to deal with the legacy of the trouble has to be something quite different. And truth to tell, I don't think we've really found a way of addressing that. Certainly, there are things that people have tried. They've tried them in Colombia, they've tried them in other places too. Things that the community as a whole can do in terms of recognition of what has happened, memorials and memorialization, regular events where there is some remembrance of what happened and some support for victims and their families and so on. And all of these are important and appropriate things. But I don't think any of us can look at it and say we really have made as much progress in dealing with the trouble and pain for the community as a whole when you've huge numbers of people, as perhaps we have at least to some extent with mental health and physical health problems in the community. I suppose the other thing I would like to say at this stage is that apart from implementation, as time passes, there are other events which have an impact. So there have been external events. For example, of course, what happened in Venezuela is a very important external event because it created all sorts of vulnerabilities with the movement of people across the border, the difficulty about managing that, the fact that people who were continuing to be involved, not those in FARC who had given up, but those who were dissidents to FARC or the ELN, and indeed other organizations, criminal gangs and so on, were able to use the vulnerability of the border, for example, with Venezuela, but not only the border with Venezuela, to create difficulties. The pandemic has created terrible difficulties. Latin America as a whole has not done very well in the pandemic. Peru has had a terrible time, Brazil too. A lot of the countries have had major problems. This is a big difficulty for any government, not just the government of Colombia. So there are major external events. And I suppose the other one I'm very conscious of is when we were trying to create a peace process in Northern Ireland, the general attitude of governments and leaders across the world was, you are a leader if you resolve conflicts, whether that was Gorbachev in Russia or Mitchell and Clinton from the United States or de Klerk, who has just sadly passed away, and Mandela. Leaders saw themselves as being leaders if they resolved conflicts. Unfortunately now, if you look at world leaders, many of them see themselves as leaders because they conduct conflicts, not because they try to resolve them. So there is a whole attitudinal problem, which I think undermines support for the process. There are particular things about Colombia. The political process, for example, which restricts presidents to one mandate, means that it's very difficult to carry through what is now. We're talking about 5 years on. If you've got short mandates, it's very difficult to both implement and carry through your process. And there are always those who are looking out to undermine you. Now, at this particular point, just a few final words. It's clear that President Duque, who was at best ambivalent about the whole thing and in truth pretty much opposed to it, he couldn't abandon it because international pressure wouldn't allow him to do that. But nevertheless, he's been at best lukewarm and not able to deliver. And of course, there are elements in the government outside of the political representatives, within the security forces, within the administration of justice process, within the civil service, who are not terribly pro the process that President Santos negotiated. But we are coming near to the end of President Duque's mandate. So that's maybe the upside of having single mandates for presidents. If you've got a bad one or one that's not helpful to what you want, then, well, you just sit it out. And talking to some friends from Colombia, even just in recent days, they came to the conclusion some time ago that they weren't going to be able to make much progress with President Duque, and therefore it was a question of both sitting it out and also hoping for a good result when the next presidential election comes up. Now, will it be a good result? Well, that's very difficult indeed to say. This far out, actually, it's difficult to say anyway. And one of the worries that I have about Colombia has really been stimulated to some degree by what happened in Peru, where there were a number of relatively moderate people who were standing for president, and then there were those who were not those who have the most overall support. But because those of a more moderate perspective were so numerous, they fractured their own votes, and the result was that whoever was going to win was not necessarily going to be winning with more than 50% of the support of the country. Some people would be voting for them because they were voting against the other candidate rather than voting for them. This is not a good place for a country to get into, but it's a constitutional problem of the system that's there, and that system is not going to be changed. So I do have some anxieties about the continuation of the process because of the presidential question, both in terms of a president who may not be supportive, but just in terms of the constitutional structure, which I think creates vulnerabilities for these kinds of processes. Having said all of that, Colombia did something really extraordinary in reaching the agreement, and it is providing lessons, positive and negative, it has to be said, for other peace processes. But it is in a difficult place, and that's why I think it is so important for all of us not only to learn the lessons of this process, but also to give as much support and encouragement as we can to those from all backgrounds who want to make it work. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. That's a fantastic way to get us kicked off into this discussion. I'll now hand over to Mariela. Mariela Cojon was an advisor in the Colombian peace process. She was involved in the negotiations, specifically on the international verification mechanisms in point 6 of the agreement. And she advised the FARC peace delegation, and she was also in that capacity responsible for liaising with members of the UN Security Council and the UN verification mission, plus other international community representatives in Colombia, including the European Union and the UNHCR. So having heard from John, whose expertise was lent in particular to advising President Santos, we're now going to hear from someone who's been more involved in advising the FARC in the same peace process. And prior to this experience, Mariela was director of Justice for Colombia, the British and Irish NGO founded by the trade union movement, working for peace, trade union, and human rights. And in that capacity, she led an initiative to bring people from Northern Ireland and South Africa to Colombia and to Havana, where the peace negotiations were taking place, to share their experiences with the Colombian peace negotiators. And she's also taken many trade union leaders and politicians to witness the human rights crisis on the ground in Colombia. And Mariela currently is the senior international officer at the Trades Union Congress, the TUC. So Mariela, how do you see the Colombian peace agreement 5 years on? And what do you see as the current challenges for peace building in Colombia?
Thank you so much, Gwen. And thank you to the organisers, to Oxford Network, to the Centre for Reconciliation and Rodemos for the invitation. It's a huge pleasure to be here and to share the panel with Gwen and Andre and John. It's great to see you and hear your thoughts. I think, well, the question sounds simple, but I think it's incredibly complicated to answer. And I don't think it's straightforward. And I think the process has been full of contradictions, really. I think there's key areas which haven't advanced, and sadly, some of those areas really point to some of the root causes of the conflict, particularly the issue of land and rural reform has been one of the least implemented areas of the peace agreement. Political participation as well has seen very little progress. And some of the areas of the agreement that deal with really building a lasting and sustainable peace, for example, the crop substitution chapter, the issue around security guarantees, they're also issues which face huge challenges in the current climate. But I think a crucial achievement that we have to acknowledge is the new political context which has been created by the agreement, the fact that any left or progressive forces cannot simply be dismissed as terrorists, which is something that has been seen historically in Colombia. That has been taken away, and I think that's a huge progress. I also think there's been some really significant achievements in the truth and justice process, and John alluded to it in terms of placing the victims at the heart of the peace agreement. When we took a lot of leaders from Northern Ireland, I think one of the key areas where they said they could now learn from Colombia was precisely on that issue of legacy issues and victims. And I think seeing the participation of civil society in mobilizations, losing some of the fear in protest, in being involved in proposing, we've seen huge demonstrations this year. And I think that is something that we can, firmly say as a result of the peace agreement, but also seeing that civil society is adopting the agreement as their own, is calling for the implementation, is putting peace at the center of all the different demands that are being pushed forward, shows a shift in the agreement being kind of taken ownership of by society, which was something that really was lacking at the beginning of the implementation process. I think it's important to say that the government hasn't complied with huge elements of its obligations, and that the FARC has. They overwhelmingly have. They've given up their weapons. They've submitted themselves to the truth and justice process, the three main components of it. They've also handed over their assets. And I think, John pointed to some of those initial reasons of the lack of implementation. And I wanted to add to some of those kind of historic reasons. I think the limited participation of civil society in the process itself, in creating the agreement, was a weakness. And it was something the government at the time resisted. And I understand that the Santos administration was under huge pressure from Uribe, and there was reasons why there was nervousness about opening it up. But the reality is that did create suspicion and more room for disinformation to be created and to be pushed out about the agreement. I think there was a lack of peace pedagogy. Work that Rodemos has done very successfully should have been led by the government at the time, really getting out to people why this agreement was not just an agreement for the FARC, but an agreement for the benefit of Colombian society. And I think the inclination of the government to try and renegotiate things that were in the agreement, once it was going through the legislative process. And again, sometimes for understandable reasons. As John pointed out, Santos was towards the end of his term. He was losing the parliamentary majority. It was difficult to get things through. When we were sitting in the implementation committee after the signing, very often it was the case that things couldn't get through the Congress, so there was renegotiation of some of the key parts of the agreement, which distorted and damaged, I think, the implementation process. And I think the FARC were very aware of, a historical legacy of governments reneging on agreements. And to address that problem, there was a lot done to try and design a process to safeguard the agreement. So the legal safeguards that were focused on, for example, to translate the government's commitments into state obligations. So the constitutional obligation that was created by the Legislative Act in 2017, which makes the government constitutionally obliged to implement the peace agreement for 3 consecutive governments. That was an important step. There was also one of the areas that I worked on the most was around the UN and the Security Council recognizing the peace agreement as an official document. That was an important step, I think, in giving it legitimacy and credibility and international recognition. And the whole system of international verification and monitoring, which has been so important in, I think, safeguarding it from attacks now from the far right and from Duque's, original stated kind of worrying, impulse to destroy the agreement. I think the international support has made it harder for him. I think John mentioned that as well. So I think having Cuba and Norway as guarantor countries, having the UN verification mission, having international support informally, whether it's from Northern Ireland or South Africa or other countries, I think all of that helped to create kind of shield around the agreement. But ultimately you need political will. And clearly with this government, I think that's very limited. I think there's always been an interest from both the Santos administration, at the time really, and some elements of people involved, that actually the decommissioning of weapons and the FARC disarming was the achievement of peace. And I think anyone who's involved in peace processes knows that the absence of weapons doesn't mean the presence of peace or of social justice. And the FARC disarming was clearly an important step, but there was actually no correlation between their disarming, for example, and the completion of that early and a very fast process compared to other peace processes, and actually the creation of socioeconomic conditions for their reintegration, of dealing with paramilitary groups, of dealing with the illegal economies, of creating opportunities. There was so much not done in preparation, and I think that created some of the groundwork for some of the issues that we're seeing today. There was a huge lack of preparation by the state in terms of infrastructure, coherence, organisation, and clearly there was this huge opposition, which was incredibly challenging and difficult to manage. I think then we come to Duque and his particular interpretation of the peace agreement and his insistence on creating a kind of simulation of implementation. He has one discourse to the international community, one discourse to his own kind of far-right constituency, and it's not often matched up. And he's created this new policy, you know, peace with legality, which is very vague in what it actually means. But essentially, a lot of it is going back to some of those old, tired, classic security policies of the Uribe administration in terms of democratic security. And I think some of the key challenges I was going to highlight, I think, what some of the key issues now are in terms of the implementation stage that we're at. One is underfunding. There's been a huge underfinancing of the implementation. The UN mission reported that at the current rate, the implementation will take 26 years rather than 15 with the current levels of budget. I think the issue of political violence and the security situation is a huge challenge. We've got the continuous and systematic assassination of social leaders, 964 social leaders in the last 4 years. That's human rights defenders, community leaders, trade unionists, environmental activists. Just environmental activists, there were 65 murdered last year. That's more than anywhere else in the world. There's been an increasing number of massacres as well taking place in rural areas. And of course, we've had, you know, almost 300 former FARC combatants assassinated who've given up their weapons in good faith. And that's causing huge alarm amongst the guerrilla, you know, former combatant population, amongst their families. They're also facing threats to their legal security. There's been some prominent, you know, leaders in the FARC community now, Martin Batalla, Harold Ordóñez, who have been accused of being dissidents falsely in those cases that collapsed. But that's obviously creating uncertainty for people. And I think, you know, this key issue of the government implementing the security chapter in the peace agreement, dismantling the paramilitary groups, tackling those illegal economies, it's very much linked to not just increasing militarization, but also increasing civilian state presence in those regions and also implementing the agreement. If you implement, you know, if you invest in the countryside, if you create opportunities for people, you also tackle a lot of those root causes of those illegal economies. I think also what we've seen under Duque is very worrying in terms of a return to accusing opposition of being terrorists or drugs traffickers or dissidents. We saw it during the protest this year. There was over 7,000 acts of police violence documented, 113 acts of gender-based violence, 44 protesters killed by the police, ministers openly trying to link protests to dissidents or to drugs, you know, and it's this old police doctrine of the internal enemy, of a counterinsurgency response to opposition, which we saw during the conflict and which actually should not be justified now. Well, it was never justified, but I think now there's even less reason that they can argue for that. And I think that's something we need to, in the international community, keep very alert to. I think there's been increasing authoritarianism, and we've seen the use of COVID as a pretext to clamp down on, you know, to try and affect the independence of the judiciary, to try and rule by decree. All of those things I think are very worrying. And as I said at the beginning, one of the roots of the conflict, the inequality in land ownership, the huge inequality in the Colombian population, that's one of the key areas where we've seen the least progress. And I think we need to be pushing for implementation of that issue. We've seen, you know, 0.1% of land a year of what annually should be formalized in order to complete with the 7 million of hectares of land that needs to be given to dispossessed peasant farmers. That is what is being reached annually. So it's only been 10% overall of all the land that's actually been formalized and given titles to campesinos for. There's also been an intensification and forcibly eradicating coca crops rather than going through a, you know, sustainable process of crop substitution for peasant farmers. And we know that forced eradication doesn't work. It doesn't result in actually dealing with the coca crop problem. But to end on a positive note, because I know I've said a lot of it's not negative, but I think it's important to acknowledge, what's really happening, but also to see the potential, because I think this agreement doesn't belong to Santos, it doesn't belong to the FARC, it doesn't belong to Duque, it's an agreement that belongs to the Colombian people. I think, as I said, there's a greater understanding amongst significant sectors of society about what this agreement can be and its transformative potential. I think the greatest achievements we've seen so far are in the truth and justice process, but I would say that I think obviously this has been one of the structures that's been most attacked by Duque and his supporters. I also think there's a lack of the military and funders of paramilitaries going through that process. At the moment, we've seen 12,967 people admitted to the jurisdiction. 9,800 of them are former members of the FARC. So we need more of, the security forces represented in that process. We need more budget for the unit for the search for the disappeared, which has been underfunded. But I think a huge progress has been finally the approval of the 16 seats in Congress that are going to be for socially, historically excluded communities to have representation in Congress. That's something that the Duque government and his supporters tried to block, and it's a huge achievement. And I think that, this opening of space for democratic participation, for popular protest, is hugely important. The 2018 electoral results, especially those are the presidential ones, even though they didn't go the way that some of us would have liked, there was the highest vote in history in favor of democratic and progressive forces. There's been, groups of pro-peace networks like Defendamos la Paz, which really, cover a huge ground in political opinions, bringing together intellectuals and opposition makers and NGOs and opinion makers in favor of the peace process. So I think there is a new climate which we need to take advantage of and to support the Colombian people in trying to achieve peace. I think the international community has to not be, waylaid by concerns about Venezuela or about the climate to let Duque get away with not implementing an obligation of the state. And I think that the current electoral context is going to be very complicated because it coincides with some of the first rulings of the FARC-EP, as well as the Truth Commission's report. And we need to make sure they're not, manipulated to whip up kind of disinformation or opposition. And I would argue that there needs to be, electoral observers for the coming elections, because we know that's a dangerous moment. But I do think we need to reclaim that agreement. It's an achievement of the Colombian people. And I think there's a lot of lessons there that we can learn, but we can't, as John said, it's early on and we can't abandon the Colombian people in their struggle for peace. So I'm sorry if I've gone over, but thank you for the time.
That's wonderful. Thank you very much, Mariela. You managed to get a huge amount of information into a short time, so thank you very much. I'll now hand over to Andre Gomes Suarez. Dr. Andre Gomes Suarez is Senior Research Fellow in the Center for Religion, Reconciliation and Peace at the University of Winchester. He's the co-founder and non-director of Rodemos el Diálogo. He's a senior consultant at Positive Negatives and honorary research associate at the University of Bristol and the UCL Institute of the Americas. He's the author of Genocide, Geopolitics and Transnational Networks, published by Routledge in 2015, and El Triunfo del No, published by Icono in Colombia in 2016. He's written and produced a graphic short story recently called Jessica, on coca growing, development and stigmatization in Colombia, which he did for Positive Negatives, and co-produced La Confianza in 2018, a song for rebuilding trust as part of peace building in Colombia. And he's done consultancies for conciliation resources, the International Organization for Migrations, the Organization of Ibero-American States, and in Colombia, the National Center for Historical Memory, the Ombudsman Office, and the Office of the High Commissioner for Peace, all targeted to various degrees in supporting the Colombian peace process. So, Andre, how do you see the Colombian peace agreement 5 years on? And what, as a reconciliation scholar, what are the contributions that the Colombian case makes to academic research on peace and reconciliation?
Thanks, Gwen, and thank you so much to John and to Mariela for the thoughtful comments that they have shared, and to Ox Peace and to Rodemos el Diálogo and to Winchester for organizing this. I want to start with a sort of positive note, despite the serious challenges that we have. I mean, I think John and Mariela have been very good at highlighting the challenges and also some of the opportunities. But if I could sort of try to draw a picture of what I see, and I guess the good news is that Colombia did not go or hasn't gone so far through the experience of what Rwanda went through in the middle of or after the peace process that they had in 1994. So we are not in the situation of Rwanda, which is very good. Unfortunately, we are not in the situation of what I would consider that it has been more successful in trying to end political violence, that is Northern Ireland. So we are not on that spectrum either. I think Colombia is so because of that, I would say, we need to look at the positive developments that have taken place, and then also understand the huge challenges ahead. And I think this is important because what we have achieved over the last 5 years in Colombia, even though some of us would expect that more things would have been achieved by now, are still things that we need to protect, and that another government that actually does not believe in the peace agenda, or another government that is even more reactionary to the ideas of the peace agreement, could dismantle, and it could take us to a far more complicated scenario. So we need to remember that as the parties agreed, the implementation of this peace agreement was meant to be done over 15 years. And we are ending the first 5 years of the implementation of this peace agreement. So this is a really important moment. It's a really important moment for Colombians, because the international community, and on that I completely agree with Mariela and with John, have done their best. I mean, most of it. I would say that probably the only one that hasn't been up to the standards is the US. Because, for example, the US has not taken the FARC out of the list of terrorist organizations, and that has had a tremendous impact on the monies that are needed for members of the FARC to participate, for example, in reconciliation processes taking place in the country. But I would say that to a large extent, the international community has played a really important role. Let's think about the role that the UN mission in Colombia has been playing. I mean, I think it's been fundamental. And the role that Europe and different countries have played throughout the implementation of the peace agreement, they have been really, really important in putting pressure on President Duque, for example, to implement the peace agreement. The last example that I can bring to the table now is the decision taken by the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court to back up the special jurisdiction for peace as the transitional justice mechanism that has allowed the ICC to say that, they are going to stop the investigation on Colombia, the preliminary investigation on Colombia, only if the Colombian government and the Colombian government respects the autonomy and the work of the special jurisdiction for peace. So I think that's a really important message from the international community to the implementation of this peace agreement. So let me try to go a bit farther in the positive developments that I've seen so far. So I think in terms of the special jurisdiction for peace, to continue with that, I think, in the case of Colombia, it's really important to recognize that the JEP has opened 7 macro cases, really important macro cases that are trying to offer justice on really complex human rights violations. Let's remember that Colombia has more than 9 million victims and that has a multiplicity of perpetrators. And what the special jurisdiction for peace has done is to focus in specific crimes, like, for example, kidnapping by the FARC, but false positives, so extrajudicial killings by the army, are looking at both those cases. And in both of those cases, they have already produce indictment against top commanders of the FARC, but also against army generals of the security forces in Colombia. So this is a really important development, and it has taken place in time record. Let's think that the Special Jurisdiction for Peace was set up in Colombia less than 4 years ago. It's only really started fully working 3 years ago. So I think that's a really important thing. The other thing that the Special Jurisdiction for Peace has done is to ask the Ministry of Defense of Colombia to create indicators to measure the progress on establishing state territorial control and the dismantling of illegal armed groups. So the Special Jurisdiction for Peace is starting to put pressure on the Colombian government and saying, as part of an state institution, to say you need to deliver, you need to absolutely deliver. And this is a jurisdiction that has legal powers and that makes, some sectors of the is creating the state infrastructure to make these things happen. The other important development, I think, is to think a bit about the work that the Truth Commission has done. The Truth Commission has received the testimonies of 5 of the presidents of Colombia who are still alive, former presidents of Colombia who are still alive. I think there is no one institution in Colombia who has done that in the past. Whether they have come to tell the truth 100% or not, but the fact is that at least these people have recognized the mandate of the Truth Commission and that they need to talk to them. And is the Truth Commission the one who is going to write this final report that is going to really come to terms with really important recommendations to the Colombian public in order to the suffering of the victims, and also recommendations about what are the transformations that need to take place inside the state structures to try to stop the continuation of the conflict. But not only that, the Truth Commission has also heard top commanders of the FARC who have acknowledged responsibility on kidnapping, for example, in front of the victims themselves. In the case of Ingrid Betancourt, there was a very impactful event taking place, and that many people could see it live stream on YouTube, but also to top commanders of the paramilitary groups like Salvatore Mancuso, who has also acknowledged responsibility and has shown the links between the paramilitary groups and state officials in Colombia. And then the other thing that I think is important to highlight is that the Truth Commission has heard Colombians in exile in more than 24 countries, has collected more than 1,200 testimonies of Colombians who had never been heard by an institution like a Colombian state institution. So I think that's a fantastic achievement. Then in terms of the FARC, I would say, 13,000 of members of the FARC demobilized, 10,500 of them are absolutely committed to the peace agreement. They are not necessarily living in the reincorporation zones, but they are committed to the peace agreement. They have set up more than 150 cooperatives throughout the country. 31 of them are led by women. They have done more than 200 spaces in which they have acknowledged responsibility and asked for apologies to the victims according to specific cases of gross human rights violations. And they have set up an organization that is doing demining. It's an incredible sort of positive development in the last 5 years. And in terms of the state, despite all the negative attitude of the president, as Mariela was saying, we have today, we know that in 2022, we will select 16 special seats in Congress for the most affected regions of the country. This will be in the House of Representatives. This has been already signed by Duque. So one of the staunchest critics now is claiming that is one of the victories of his government to have created those 16 seats. So I think that's absolutely fantastic. 54% of the members of the FARC who have reincorporated are benefited from productive projects. So somehow the monies of the international community have been redirected to them through the state institutions in Colombia. I think if we think that we have a government that is against this whole process and we're still seeing this progress, imagine what could happen if we had a government that is absolutely committed to the implementation of the peace agreement. And the final thing that I would say is that still in the unit of the Fiscalia, of the prosecutor office, we have seen that of the 300 murders of FARC members, of former FARC members, 44 have been 44 convictions of perpetrators. So I think, when we think about the levels of impunity in other cases, this shows a degree of progress. So with that in mind, I would say, and I knowing that I have probably coming towards the end of my 10 minutes, and I haven't had the chance to talk about what this teaches us as academics, I would just like to wrap up by saying these are really important developments. However, as I said, 300 members of the FARC, 306 members of the FARC have been killed in the last 4 years. We have not been created. The government has not created the agrarian jurisdiction that was meant to solve the conflicts in the countryside. The land fund, as Mariela was talking, is not progress beyond 40%. The land registry has only managed to create 5.4 of the demarcation of the lands. The National Commission of Security Guarantees should meet on a monthly basis and hasn't met in the last 6 months. So it meets really irregularly because the president doesn't call it. And the comprehensive security system for the participation in politics has been sidelined by the government policy on creating a different scheme to protect people doing politics. And for that reason, it's very difficult to say that has been progress on security guarantees for participation in politics. So I wrap up by saying this. As academics, what I think we're learning for the Colombian peace process is that we need to do interdisciplinary research, that we need to do lots of policy engagement if we really want to support peace building, and finally, that we need to deconstruct national narratives about peace building, because sometimes we keep very simplistic pictures of what's happening in a peace process, but it's always so many things happening at the same time that is very difficult to have a balanced view of the progress and the setbacks that take place in peace building.
Fantastic, Andre. Thank you so much. So I think our 3 speakers have given us a lot to think about. We've already got some questions that have been written in the chat. So I think what I'll do is I've also got a question for each of you. So I will pose my question and read out the questions that have appeared in the chat, and we'll do then a round of responses to those. And in the meantime, while we're doing that, those who would like to ask questions in person, please do raise your hand using the reaction button, or write, I have a question in the chat. And I will, in the next round of questions, invite those of you who raise your hand now to ask your questions to the speakers. So first of all, my question to John is about the role of the British government at the moment. The British government had an important role to play in the Colombian peace process as penholder for Colombia to the United Nations. In the face of all of the challenges to implementation, which we've heard about from all 3 of you, what is the UK government doing, and is it doing enough? Could it do more? So that's my question to John. To Mariela, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the problem of the dissidences of the FARC. Some reports suggest that over the space of time since the abandonment of the peace agreement by prominent FARC commanders, including Jesus Santrich and Ivan Marquez, there are now over 2,600 members of dissident groups of the FARC. How do you see this phenomenon, and how serious a problem is it for the continuing implementation of the peace agreement? And for Andre, I wonder if you could reflect on the impact of both the Truth Commission report, which is expected in June after the elections, and the announcement that we're expecting of the punishments or the sanctions of the 2 sentences by the HEP that you mentioned, both the extrajudicial killings by the armed forces and the kidnapping by the FARC, these are going to have considerable impact in public opinion. Will they promote reconciliation, or will they divide Colombian society further? So now turning to the questions that have been posed in the chat, Liz Carmichael asks to Mariela and anyone else, who is responsible for seeing the agreement is implemented, and what structural role does civil society have in overseeing implementation? Eric Hyom has asked, should the urgency and priority of an agreement be that the children and grandchildren of victims not have to carry on the fight? Why should innocent children on either side be dragged into the conflict? Mothers and grandmothers would be more on board with such aims, perhaps also fathers and grandfathers. I think that's an open question to anyone who'd like to respond to it. Similarly, Stella Charman has asked, what is the impact of the presence of 1.7 million Venezuelan refugees on the prospects for peace? And Beatriz Bejarano has asked Mariela if you could expand on the Comunes party, the FARC party, its political relevance, the perception that the Colombian public has of it, and does it have a future as a party? So I think maybe we'll go in reverse order this time. We'll start with Andre.
Thank you, Gwen. Okay, so let me try to, I think you have a fantastic question, and I think this depends. It's not so straightforward, and it's perhaps a very difficult question to answer. The Truth Commission report will come out in June next year, and it will have to be disseminated between June and August. There's 2 months of dissemination. The Truth Commission is going to create a follow-up committee that is going to take oversee the implementation of the recommendations of the Truth Commission. And I'm talking about timelines here on who is going to continue the work of the Truth Commission, because next year we have a political campaign and a new president coming into power. In the moment that the report of the Truth Commission comes out, we will still be under the presidency of Duque, and the new president, but the new president will have been elected by then, and the new president would start in August 2017, in August, so 2 months after. So it would depend on how the next president also takes that report and how that is seen as a way to actually take responsibility from the Colombian state and the state institutions, and to invite the whole of Colombian society to see itself in the mirror and to advance in the recommendations of that report, what could help move forward in the direction of reconciliation. But let's remember that reconciliation is a journey, it's not a state. We are not going to get to reconciliation the day that the report of the Truth Commission is published. This report would contribute if other sectors, powerful sectors of Colombian society and if the Colombian state come together to recognize the wrongdoings of the past and continue implementing important measures that need to take place to transform the roots of the causes of the conflict. In terms of the HEP, I think that would be absolutely fundamental. One of the main problems that we have in Colombia, as we all know, is the large levels of impunity. In Colombia, the impunity in most of the cases in the criminal system are above 90%. 90% levels of impunity. If you have a special jurisdiction for peace that actually imposes sanctions on the perpetrators of gross human rights violations, and the sanctions are not related to jail, but to reconstruct the social fabric of the communities, that's going to set a really important example that can help bring different sectors of society together. So the restorative nature of the sanctions that the special jurisdiction for peace is gonna produce could be absolutely fundamental in order to pave the road for reconciliation. If you allow me to take one of the questions, just for someone who was talking about who is overseeing implementation, the short answer to that is it is very complex. There are multiple mechanisms overseeing implementation of the Colombian peace agreement. So on the side of the international community, there are at least 3 organizations doing that. The United Nations is constantly overseeing implementation, and the secretary, and there is the UN mission to Colombia has to write every 3 months a report to the Security Council on how the implementation of the peace agreement is going. But at the same time, there is a special secretariat of President Mujica and President González, who were the 2 international big personalities supporting the implementation of the peace agreement. That's made of 2 Colombian institutions, CERAC, that is a resource center doing research on conflict, and CINEP, that is an NGO of the Jesuits, and they have written the 10th report of implementation of the peace agreement. And there are other organizations within the Colombian Congress. For example, some political parties have created a special group of coalition to oversee implementation of the peace agreement, and different NGOs have also started to try to produce some reports on that. So I think it's a multiplicity of factors, from the local level to the national level to the international level, trying to follow up. And of course, the Kroc Institute, and I should have mentioned this, the first one, that is the official institution trying to follow the 571 components of the peace agreement that need to be implemented. So with that, I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Andre. And the Kroc Institute has just released its next study, which covers the period of July 2021 to September 2021. So I know we'll all be interested to read that. Mariela.
Thanks, Gwen. So to pick up on a couple of questions, and also your question, in terms of the dissidents, I think there's various groups and different types of dissidents, and all sorts of complex situation at the moment in the different regions. I think the situation that led specifically to Jesus Santrich and Iván Márquez was a very specific set of circumstances. It was clearly significant that the lead negotiator, the head of the negotiating table, felt unable to continue in the process, and obviously it was damaging in terms of his decision. But I think there was also a big expose earlier this year or last year which exposed some of the attempts to try and sabotage the peace process and the entrapment process that happened against Santrich. I think the key thing really to note is that the majority of the FARC have remained in the legal process, in the peace process, committed to that process, and it's been very few numbers really comparatively to other processes that have gone to dissident groups. And I think it's in the larger context of the need for negotiations with remaining groups, in terms of the ELN being a significant guerrilla organization, that the talks have collapsed, and hopefully a new administration would attempt to enter into negotiations and to try and create the conditions for peace. I think on the significance of Gomes, of the FARC political party, I think realistically, like the future of that party electorally, they haven't done overwhelming, the seats are there because it's part of the agreement in terms of historical reparations for what happened with the Patriotic Union, and having those seats as part of the political participation settlement. I think the significance obviously is about opening up the space for political participation beyond just the FARC, but also to anyone who has opposing views or left views and they want to participate politically. So I think it's more that emblematic significance, and also the creation of these kind of broad alliances of significant sectors of the political arena that support the implementation of the peace agreement and have some progressive political agenda. I think the FARC did face huge obstacles when in that transition process, and that can't be underestimated. Even just the registration as a legal party, the financing, there were all sorts of problems that the UN had to intervene on. And, there was all sorts of issues at the time when they were setting up the party. Obviously, there's a lot of stigmatization. There's a lot of people that will be scared to be involved with them or be associated with them. The killings and the violence against their members clearly is another huge challenge. But I think really the aim of the peace agreement is not to create a political platform for the FARC. It was about creating the space for people who have different opinions to be able to participate in politics, and creating that democratic opening up in Colombia, which historically has been so shut down to allowing opposition. I just wanted to add just one point on Venezuela. I think it's really important because the Colombian government does a lot of PR on its treatment of Venezuelan migrants, and whilst that might be commendable, I think it's really important to not allow that issue to be used as an excuse to defend underfunding the implementation. And I think that's something we need to be aware of. And just to add on the UK government before John gives his view, I think they have a really incoherent position in terms of supporting the peace process at the Security Council, yet not being outspoken enough about the peace process and human rights abuses, and also allegedly collaborating in training and issues which might need more human rights focus. So thank you.
Thank you, Mariela. John.
Well, first of all, in terms of the question that you asked, could the UK government do more? And the answer, of course, is yes, they could. And they could do more in various ways. One of the difficulties that we have is that the UK government is torn all over the place on so many issues at the moment. They're preoccupied with Brexit, they're preoccupied with the pandemic, COP26 and other international issues that have been around for the government. And it is a government which does not have a clear strategic view on almost anything. So, I don't think Colombia should feel it's being singled out for a lack of a coherent policy. It's just, share the pain of everybody else, because we have a government that does not have any real clarity as to what it is trying to achieve in the overall sense. There may be some specifics that it identifies. Let's make COP26 a success or something like that. But clarity is not something that this government is famous for. And in fairness, there are a huge number of issues, and indeed a huge number of conflicts. I remember when I started to get involved in this whole business of addressing conflicts in different parts of the world, there were maybe half a dozen major conflicts, and you could keep up with what was going on with most of them a fair bit of the time. Now it's completely impossible, because every place you turn to, there's an insoluble difficulty about it, apart altogether from the wider global problems of pandemic, geopolitical crisis, and so on. So there genuinely is a difficulty. Now, what we've tried to do at Westminster is a small number of us in the Lords and in the Commons who are interested in Colombia have been trying, reasonably regularly to get questions in, either written questions or questions on the floor of the House to the government, to try to just help government understand that this issue has not gone away, interest in it has not gone away, they need to keep responding to it. And of course, one of the big difficulties has been the cut in funding. When DFID was absorbed into FCDO, there was also subsequently a major cut in funding because of the financial crisis that the government experienced. And that has affected every area of government, in some cases quite extraordinarily so, but it has affected international aid. So there are a whole raft of areas. Now, Mariela makes a particularly good point about cooperation with security. And this is a difficulty in the Middle East, in the Gulf. It's a difficulty in Latin America. It's an emergent difficulty with other countries as well. And there isn't a very easy answer to it. One can simply say, okay, well, you should pull out, not involve yourself in it at all, and simply be critical. And yeah, you could do that. But the difficulty is that your criticism just tends to bounce off like water off a duck's back. And so there is an argument about trying to engage and make a difference. What happens if you engage and don't make a difference? Well, that's the dilemma in many areas, in many places. at a completely different level, it's a problem with China at the moment. Well, how do you engage with China? Do you say, well, we're not going to engage with you? Well, China doesn't get terribly worried about Britain not engaging with it. But if you do you make any actual difference? It's a very difficult problem. And I don't think there is any easy answer. I think we're all struggling to find the best way. So I think, what we can actually do is simply try to make sure that the British government doesn't forget about the problem. It does remain with responsibility at a Security Council level, as Mariela has said, but to try to keep drawing the questions back on a regular basis. It's not satisfactory, and frankly, it's not very satisfying either. But it's what we can do. Now, there is another question in the chat about explaining the low priority of the peace process and its implementation in the current electoral debate, by which I assume it means the electoral debate in Colombia itself. And I think the problem that you have is something like this. When there is continuing violence directed in the past, as it was, from a clear source, FARC, and there are people saying, look, if we have a peace process, we'll get a resolution of this. Then there is a certain kind of attraction and interest for people. They want to say they're for it or against it, but it is a topic of debate. But when the peace process is passed, it's a bit like, eaten bread is soon forgotten. People then begin to turn to other things, and there are plenty of other things to occupy and preoccupy them. And they don't necessarily see the peace process as being as high on the agenda. That's the case for some people. For other people, and I'm talking to some relatively young people from Colombia, I get a sense, particularly for young people who are in the upper middle classes, quite well off and so on, they are either not terribly concerned, or they're actually beginning to wonder about their own future in Colombia. And I've been talking to a number who are just trying to keep their options open. They wonder, how are things going to go? What's going to happen with this next election? Do we really want to commit ourselves, and more importantly, our children, to being in Colombia? So although it's not part of the current debate, as the questioner says, I don't think it means that the question of violence and instability in the country has necessarily gone out of everyone's minds. It just may not necessarily be to the fore in the debate itself.
Thank you, John. I'm going to now open up for questions from people who would like to ask them in person. So we've got Camilo, who's raised his hand. I've got Sonia Garzon has written in the chat. I don't know if Sonia, if you would like to ask your question in person, you're very welcome to do so. And anyone else who would like to raise their hand, now is your opportunity to do so. Camilo.
Thank you. When I have two questions, briefly, for rather complex answers. One for Lord Allardyce and another one for Dr. Gomes. The one for Lord Allardyce has to do with, you spoke in your first intervention about moderation and about the chance of Peru, of being into having two very radical candidates as the only option for government. Do you believe that moderation in government is necessary in order to build a peace process, or do you believe that transitional governments can have radical factions? And for Dr. Gomes, in that same sense, do you believe that a progressive government in Colombia would guarantee interest implementation, or do you believe that, for example, with the left trying to farther themselves from the Communist Party, a progressive government would not necessarily be interested in implementing the peace agreement?
Thank you, Camilo. Sonia, would you like to ask your question, or shall I read it out for you? You've raised your
in the chat, and it's about the consequences of implementing a peace process after the refusal through the democratic process of the referendum. So my question is, in which way peace institutions are tackling the lack of legitimacy that resulted from this outcome in another emission of this dialogue somebody was speaking about radicalization and was saying that it was very difficult to tackle that. But if we started with less than the 50% supporting the peace process and implementation, and then there are less public attention towards the implementation, so the legitimacy can be going down. So this is a problem that I think is also an issue for peace institutions. So I don't know if the speakers have at some point or some comments too about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Sonia. I think that's really one of the most fundamental questions in the current scenario, is the legitimacy, rather I would say the enduring legitimacy deficit of the peace agreement, which was reaffirmed in the 2018 elections when Ivan Duque, who had been part of the opposition to the peace agreement, was elected president. And I think that the trouble that Duque has been, the trouble of Duque is also having been elected with that mandate. It's, even if he'd wanted to, even if he had all the political will in the world, it would have been very difficult for him to implement fully. We've also got I'll just read out here, because one of our viewers on YouTube has posed a question. Jiri Ruzek says, it was mentioned here that the FARC agreement serves as a lesson for other peace agreements. Does it also serve as a lesson for the peace process with the ELN, despite its very different nature, the ELN being the remaining guerrilla group in Colombia? And then we have Celino Gallo Cruz. Would you like to ask your question in person, or shall I read it out for you?
I don't have my camera set up, but that's the question there. Yes, you can read it out.
Okay, thanks, Alina. So for anyone who would like to respond, could you say something about the role of transnational industries and or extractive industries like palm oil in implementation of the peace process? So that's to anyone who would like to respond to that question. Perhaps I might also extend that question, if no one else has got their hand up at the moment, to ask about, perhaps maybe Andrei could say something about this. The role of third parties in the conflict has long been a thorny issue in the Colombian conflict. And the Special Jurisdiction for Peace was initially tasked with investigating the role of third parties. And I think this is something that other peace processes worldwide have been keen on also following, in terms of the responsibility of multinational companies and private sector actors in human rights violations and how to bring them to justice. But of course, in the process that Mariela spoke about, the legislative process and the renegotiation of the agreement, this was weakened to make it such that the participation of third parties in the Special Jurisdiction for Peace was voluntary. I wonder if Andrei could maybe talk a bit about what's been happening on that front and what can we learn for other peace processes in terms of safeguarding transitional justice so that third-party actors have to participate. And then Lee Payne, and with this I'll close this round of questions, has asked me to read this out. Can anyone reflect on the ICC, the International Criminal Court decision regarding dropping Colombia but investigating Venezuela? Does that bolster or hinder the process or have no effect at all? So I think we'll go back the other way in this round. We'll turn first of all to Lord Alderdice.
Thank you very much, Gwen, and thank you for the question.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Hold on a moment, John. I've just realized, sorry, there was a question that I missed in the chat and I would love to add it because it's from John Dew. Surely we in the UK should be more concerned that failures in the implementation and viability of the 2016 agreement in rural areas have contributed significantly to the massive increase in cocaine production, which has had a direct impact on increased crime and violence on our streets here in the UK. So that's another thing to add there into the mix. Apologies for interrupting you, John. Over to you.
Not at all. Thanks, Gwen. I mean, one of the difficulties I find in these many situations is that people speak about what should happen or what people should think. For example, this question from John, surely we should be more concerned about failures and so on. Well, there may be all sorts of things that people should do or that should happen, but they don't. And one can complain about them, but it doesn't actually make any great difference. And in terms of something of that kind, I think John's absolutely right. We should be more concerned. People should be picking up on this. But it's extremely difficult to persuade people to pick up on a particular issue that when there are so many issues on the agenda. And so there's just a practical and real difficulty about getting attention, getting bandwidth at all, whenever people are so preoccupied with many other issues. That's the first. The second thing is to respond to the question that was put particularly to myself about radical politics as over against moderation. The problem is really this. Politics right across the world has become extremely polarized in a way that has not been the case in my lifetime. It used to be when I would go to the United States, for example, I would meet and talk to Republicans who were to the left of some Democrats and Democrats that were to the right of some Republicans. Now there is a profound polarization, but it's also a toxic polarization because people do not work, as they say, across the aisle anymore. There is a profound split in the country. It's absolutely true in the UK as well. It happened over Brexit and Remain. It has continued to be the case, and there's a great deal of antipathy. Now, why did that come about? There are lots of reasons for it, but one of the reasons was that people on the left began to discover relatively early on that there were tactics and approaches that could be taken that would canvass the support of people to bring about the results that they wanted, results that were quite difficult to bring about whenever, for example, a lot of the press was in the hands of people who were on the right. So social media and lots of other techniques were able to be canvassed. And indeed, people like Clinton and Blair and so on were able to be relatively successful. The problem was that the techniques that they devised and started to use, the people on the right then started to say, ha, that's very clever. We're going to do those things too. And the result has been that all of these techniques and tactics of elections and getting a support and so on and so on have been used to increasing effect by both sides. The result is that you end up with extremely polarized communities. In many cases, not all, but in many cases, almost a 50-50 split. Now, this creates a country you simply can't run properly. There has to be some preparedness to work across the differences if the country is going to work. Otherwise, you simply get stymied. You get a president like Obama elected, and he can't deliver anything because the Congress is against him. And so the reason that I identified the Peru example, but it expressed a similar concern for other places, is that it seems to me politics globally has become extremely polarized, and the result of that is not good. It's not a question of saying, oh, well, we might get a more progressive government in, and it'll just make sure that it runs, even if it only has 51%. But the truth is, next time round, it'll be the other way. And then you will get ricocheting backwards and forwards, and the country does not go forward in a constructive way. And for me, it seems clear that we have to find a way of repairing those splits and getting people who do not agree on things to nevertheless work together in the overall interests of the country and of all the people in the country. We don't go down that road, and we go down the road of increasing splits and divisions, we're in for trouble, not success. And of course, it's happening at a global level too. After the end of the Cold War, we thought there might be a new world order. Now what we're seeing is a new Cold War, with people being forced to line up either behind China on the one hand or behind the United States on the other hand, whether you agree with them on most things or not. So this business of splitting, it does not have a good outcome. And that's why I spoke in the way that I did. And I think it's true for Colombia, but I think it's true globally.
Thank you, John. Mariela.
Thanks. I think just to say on the kind of the political scene in Colombia, I think it's interesting as well, because I think the center has moved so to the right in Colombia that, someone like Petro can be seen as a kind of Castro Chavista option, whereas in Europe, his policies would be seen as quite moderate social democrat policies. And I think that's something that when we're looking at Colombia, we need to be aware of the kind of heightened political discourse and disinformation in Colombia. But I do think the fact that there is that kind of peace caucus in the Congress, and there has been this rallying around the peace agreement, I hope that might create, some way of rallying around a candidate, whether they're seen as, more left or more centre, that supports peace. And I hope that the lesson that some of the people that promoted a blank vote to stop Petro and actually ended up with Duque, I hope that lesson might be reflected on it in next year's election. I think there's a lot in there. John G's point on coca crops, I agree. It is hard to get any cut through on Colombia here in the press. We've been trying for many years, but I think the issue of coca is significant in that I don't think it has the same kind of, political dangers, in the sense that I think it's something that you can get a lot of broad support around in terms of dealing with the drugs problem from whatever kind of political persuasion you come from. And actually, the peace agreement is the best roadmap you have to deal with the issue of coca production and cocaine. And I think that's somewhere where, a lot of people from different political backgrounds would agree that that's a very comprehensive way of dealing with it. So I do think it's something we should be, pushing our government to talk about more in terms of implementation. And on multinational companies, I know Andrea was going to talk about third parties, and that is something where the HEP still could be receiving third parties, and we would be, urging that to happen. From a trade union perspective, clearly there's been a lot of, allegations of issues around trade union abuses and even assassinations of workers, working in either subsidiary or companies. And I think there's a lot to be done in terms of raising the issue of kind of corporate responsibility in Colombia, but also the incoherence of the, territorial piece as envisioned in the peace agreement, and the emphasis on extractive industries, which are often affecting environmental rights, but also Indigenous and Afro-Colombian community rights. And that would just lead me to end on something that I think is amiss in our analysis, is also to emphasize that the peace agreement had this huge groundbreaking element in terms of having a gender focus and equalities focus around women, around LGBT, around Black and Indigenous communities. And that is another element of the peace agreement that really has not been implemented, and that the gender focus has been really poor. And I think it's something the international community really celebrated at the time, and we should keep raising the need to implement that focus, cross-cutting across the agreement.
Thank you. Andrea, I wonder if you could respond. I'm sorry, it's 12, it's past, and I know that John is going to need to leave us in a moment. So John, if you have to leave before, then we thank you very, very much. But Andrea, please try to make your wrapping up comments, and I'll then do some concluding remarks. But John, if you have to leave, then thank you anyway, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, Gwen, and thank you, John, for being here, really. Okay, I think I'm gonna skip the point on third parties, and because I think Mariela has touched upon it a bit, and I think that, I there are lots of questions that were left without a response, and probably I want to give quick responses to some of them. So the first one that I want to just quickly say is the one about the peace referendum and the lack of legitimacy. And I think, that's the question is really important, because if we think about who are the people who use the most the peace referendum today, are the ones who won. The people or the politicians who promoted the no, to constantly say that the agreement should not be implemented. But they only won for a very narrow margin, that it was 0.2%. And I think there is a big question here about how is it that the people who supported and campaigned for the yes have not reconsider about what are the important lessons and how do we remember that episode. So I think there is a lack of also seeing that there was something important that happened there, and that is not, I think the question is really important because it's not going to be solved easily. But if there is a way in which this can be solved, is by the Colombian people in elections electing candidates for the presidency and for Congress who are in favor of the implementation of the peace agreement. That's the best way to give a mandate to a next president who clearly says, we are in favor of the implementation of the peace agreement. That's the only way how that thing that happened in 2016 can be healed a bit by bringing the political support for the implementation. So that's the first point that I would do. The second point that I would like to make is in regards to whether the peace process with the FARC give us lessons for the peace process with the ELN. Absolutely, yes, of course it does. It does, because I think it gives lessons in terms of, what are the sort of mechanisms that need to be put into place to make sure that the implementation of a peace agreement is not derailed. If there is something that the ELN is very concerned, is that they think that if we go and sign a peace agreement with a Colombian government and then a new president is elected and they don't implement because there is no political will, how do we know that the transformations that we want to see in the territory are going to take place? So I think that even though there has been some progress in monitoring of implementation of the peace agreement in Colombia with the FARC, I think there are really important lessons to be taken about, do we really need to make referendums in order to put a peace agreement through? What are the sort of reforms that we need to do to the constitution in order to implement a peace agreement, and how do we do them? And if we think about that, that's really important, because some of the parties who oppose some of the legislative implementation of the peace agreement were parties who actually saw a possibility in the next elections in which they saw opposing Santos' peace process in parliament as a strategy to win the next elections. So, these are really important lessons that we need to take forward. Finally, I want to finish with another thing that I want to mention before I finish is the question about children. And I think it's important to mention this a bit because I don't want to, leave it aside. And is that if we think about the special jurisdiction for peace in this moment, for example, the special jurisdiction for peace has prioritized, in the case 07, the investigation on the forced recruitment of children by the FARC. So again, it's thinking about children, and the special jurisdiction for peace in this moment hasn't really said anything about the role of forced recruitment in terms of the security forces of Colombia, but as far as I understand, they are also doing investigations on that front. So there is a concern on the side of the transitional justice institutions to try to tackle the issue of the youth and the impact of violence in the youth. And the Truth Commission, for example, has a really important line of work with youth and working with Generación B and many of the youth of Colombia to try to think about how is it that we can learn the lessons from the past in order to avoid this repeating itself. And I finish with the final question, that it was the question that asked Camilo, that has to do with a progressive government, whether a progressive government would be a guarantee for implementation. I completely believe that it is the case. A progressive government should be a guarantee, and I think it would be in the case of Colombia. But I think there is one serious concern that I have that I think was highlighted by John, and is that it cannot do it on its own. So if a progressive government from the left gets to power and builds bridges with the center, then it will create enough political support from different sectors of society to make it happen. But if that progressive government gets to power and believes that is going to run the country on its own against the center, is going to put itself in a corner in which it's going to have so many enemies that these enemies from the center right, and from the center and from the extreme right are going to block every single thing that this government is going to try to do. And that involves also the implementation of the peace agreement. So that's the biggest challenge that a government from the left has in Colombia. But and that's the reason why I would say that people who have the possibility to talk, to send to sectors in the center, to send to sectors in the left, and to sectors in the center right, that play a role of bridge building, because peace building implies building the broader sort of alliances possible that you can build in order to create minimum consensus to try to move forward in very serious, difficult structural reforms that you need to do, in which you're going to find many opposing actors who are very powerful, and you can only defeat them if you have a broad alliance, political alliance, to do that.
Thank you, Andre. Well, I think that this has been an absolutely fantastic webinar. Thank you so much to John, to Mariela, and to Andre for your time and for your insights. We've covered so much ground. I won't try to summarize everything. I think I'll just say a couple of things to wrap up. The first thing I think that all of our speakers have highlighted is the importance in peace processes of continued attention after the signing of the agreement 5 years on, and the need for those of us who are supporting or who've supported, who've accompanied the Colombian peace process in different ways, to continue to provide that support. And I think that speaks to the co-responsibility principle of Rodemos el Diálogo that I mentioned at the beginning. We are all invested in this, and it impacts us as a British society, as well as John Dew's question highlighted about the impact of the increased coca production on the streets of the UK. I think this continued attention and continued support is important because the peace agreement, as we've heard today, faces so many challenges. One is the rising and very worrying violence across the country, in particular assassinations of former FARC combatants who laid down their weapons in good faith, and social leaders and various kinds of peace activists and people who put their lives on the line to support this peace agreement. The protests of this year has been, another important thing that we've discussed here that has, in many ways shown the challenges involved in building peace and ending violence. The challenge of legitimacy has been signaled as a major problem that the Colombian Peace Accord faces, and so more than ever it needs our support and our recognition. And the underfunding, which has been mentioned several times as one of the problems coming from the Duque administration, as well as what many have described as a lack of political will to really fully implement the whole sense of the agreement. I think the principle that we have also in Rodemos el Diálogo of solidarity is an important one to bring back here. The solidarity of the international community with Colombia, and the solidarity of academics who work on Colombia and on peace processes more generally, for us to, as Andre said, not just continue researching from different interdisciplinary perspectives what's going on, but also engaging with policy, sending messages to those contacts that we have in Colombia, finding ways that we can pledge our support as academics, I think is a very important call to action, and perhaps valuable, not just within the Colombian context, but more widely at a time in which there are many challenges in the world. Academia should be definitely finding ways to contribute, I think. We've also had many of the achievements which the Colombian Peace Agreement has left as lessons for future peace processes. And I think one of the things that all our speakers have noted is that one thing is achievements on paper in the Colombian Peace Agreement when it was signed in 2016, which was, very much lauded. For example, the gender focus was celebrated internationally as the first time a peace agreement incorporated a gender focus. But another thing is the implementation of that agreement. And as we've heard, the implementation faces numerous numerous challenges. But I think that in terms of implementation, some of the achievements I'll just mention briefly that we've touched on today. One is the speedy and efficient disarmament of over 13,000 men and women from the FARC, the majority of whom remain committed to staying civilians and not going back to war. The recognition of victims in the design of the peace agreement has been another thing that we've touched on, and the importance of the work, both of the transitional justice, the whole transitional justice system, which includes the Special Jurisdiction for Peace, the Truth Commission, and the Unit for the Search of the Disappeared in the conflict. These are important achievements of the Colombian peace agreement for numerous reasons, but they continue to do a lot of work, which we will all be continuing to follow in the coming months and years. And I think that just finally to mention the new political climate, which Mariela has mentioned, has been product of the peace agreement in many ways, the protests that we saw this year, and also the proliferation of alternative possibilities in the elections, both in 2018 and today. And I think I'll just finish by saying that I think the reflection that we've been having throughout about the role of politics and governments and who's in charge is absolutely crucial for peace studies more widely to take stock of the role of politics in peace, because peace is political in every single sense of the word political, because it involves a negotiation between warring parties, and it involves a negotiation between a government and the rest of the political establishment more widely, a political establishment which changes and renovates with each both national and local election, providing a new framework and a new landscape that politics has to be done through. And it's also political, of course, because of the relationship between the state and civil society more broadly, and the role of public opinion in peace processes, I think, has been highlighted as extremely important here today in order to provide legitimacy and also ownership of peace processes. And so I think that, the signal that all our speakers have made about the importance of the 2022 presidential and congressional elections for the Colombian peace process is something that we need to keep an eye on. And the congressional elections in particular, I think, are important because there will be no overall majority of any party in the Congress. There are many political parties today. And so there will necessarily have to be these alliances that Andrea was just mentioning, the bridge building that will need to happen through government, through Congress, and with different sectors of civil society in order for the peace process to continue facing the challenges that it has today and prospering into the future, as I know that we all hope that it does. So with that, I will close there, and just to thank everyone again for their contributions today, the speakers, those who asked questions. They were very insightful and important questions. I think we've had a really fantastic discussion today, and thank all of you for coming. And again, thanks to OxPeace and the University of Winchester Centre for Religion, Reconciliation and Peace for allowing us to co-host this dialogue with you today. So perhaps